I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our story of European history by talking about the origins of the Renaissance. So, here are our basic objectives for today. Take a minute to absorb them, and then we'll pick up our story where we left off. As you hopefully remember from last time, we talked a little bit about how the Middle Ages collapsed. The crisis of the 14th century collapsed the Middle Ages for a variety of different reasons. The Black Death was one of these factors. Famine from drought and flooding was another. The collapse of the authority of the Catholic Church, coupled with the 100 Years' War, all of this led European society under feudalism to start to fall apart. So, what's going to replace feudalism in Europe? Well, it's this new era called the Renaissance. As you may or may not know, the Renaissance started in what is today Italy. But during the Renaissance period, Italy was not a unified territory. There was no sense of central Italian identity. There was this vague sense of Romanness that still existed a little bit, but most of Italy was divided up into these competing city-states that you see here. Each of these cities operated as its own independent government, controlling the city itself and then the contado, the sort of area around the city, the territory, and the smaller villages in the outlying sort of hinterlands. This led to significant competition between these Italian city-states for wealth, for prestige, for power, for territory, as all of these cities fought with each other and competed in order to try to become the dominant power in what is today on the Italian peninsula. So the Renaissance itself is somewhat of a reconnection with antiquity. As you remember from our first intro lesson, Greco-Roman thought spread across the Mediterranean world, but then, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, a lot of that went away, a lot of the structure went away. And so, Italian scholars started studying these ancient ideas and found them very compelling. The most important person to popularize sort of Greco-Roman thought is a guy named Petrarch. He started trying to teach a different version of history that didn't necessarily rely on the Catholic Church. And also this idea of progress, this idea that humans develop over time and human society develops over time. And it's not just sort of this, we're not in this static period. Because in the Middle Ages, people sort of believed that we have these major eras in history. You have the Roman era, and then there's this medieval era where not much changes. And then at the end, Jesus is going to come back and the world is going to end. Well, Petrarch argued against that and more or less argued that human beings actually have the power to interact with their world. And he brought back the ideas of humanism that we hopefully remember back from the ancient Greeks. The ideas that humans had unlimited potential and had the ability to affect and shape their world. So, during the Renaissance, we're going to see a lot of Greco-Roman themes. Raphael's famous School of Athens, which you see here, is this sort of idealized utopia where all the great thinkers of antiquity could get together and discuss their ideas. And all of these Italians sort of tied their heritage back to the ancient Romans. And so here's a primary source about specifically the city of Florence. So pause and take a moment to read it. And hopefully you can see how the Florentians and eventually other Italians saw themselves as the heirs to the Greco-Roman world, and that their greatness should eventually rival to some degree the greatness of the Romans. So this Greco-humanism, this new Renaissance humanism is somewhat similar to Greek humanism, but it focused specifically on the intellectual development of people. For example, rather than simply, during the Middle Ages, almost all education was controlled by the church, and it was focused on memorizing church doctrine and then, of course, becoming literate in Latin. During this time period, we see a great expansion of the fields of study, specifically the development of the 7 liberal arts, reviving a lot of the things that the Greco-Roman scholars and students prized. And so we can see things like logic and grammar, but also astronomy, music, arithmetic, stuff like that. And so you can see that the curriculum in the Renaissance is becoming pretty recognizable to modern scholars. Here we see another primary source about the values of the Renaissance, so pause. And hopefully you can see that the takeaway here is that people should be trying to build their mental capacity and that humans have this great, almost unlimited potential. Petrarch here also describes what he saw as the ideal Renaissance man. So pause and read. What we see, of course, is a much broader course of study with the idea that a Renaissance man shouldn't just specialize in one thing, but should have a broad exposure to a whole variety of different fields. To a large extent, if you're a student today, hopefully you recognize this with the idea that we have a series of general education credits that you have to go out and become somewhat proficient in a variety of different subjects. You can't just specialize in one, because we feel like citizens, the people in society, should have knowledge of a bunch of different fields. Petrarch also translated a lot of the Greco-Roman styles into Italian, and rewrote specifically the Roman orator Cicero, but a whole bunch of other Roman thinkers as well, and brought back this style of Roman argumentation that became very popular. During the Middle Ages, people would just sort of copy other people's arguments sort of verbatim, just copying down the form of the arguments. Petrarch brought back the idea that you need to prove and argue these things in order for people to accept them. Eventually, we started to see massive amounts of competition, as we talked about before, in each of these Italian city-states. Each one of them developed their own sort of speciality, their own thing that they were the best at. And so, for example, Venice became a center of trade. Milan became a center of banking. A center of banking and trade as well. Florence was a series of cloth merchants who also became wealthy bankers. And so each of these city-states specialized in a variety of different fields. And as they discovered, as these cities became more urban and more modern, they rediscovered a lot of Greco-Roman ideas, types of plumbing and infrastructure, that helped improve the quality of city life. Medieval life was very rural, as we talked about last lesson, centered around the manor, but as more and more people started moving into these cities, they needed to develop the infrastructure in order to survive. And so they would look back to Greco-Roman texts in order to see how the very urban Greco-Romans lived, and then tried to copy some of the best pieces of that. Each city also developed their own guild system, and these guilds would control trade and commerce within these cities. We could see the trade routes connecting across Italy, and we can see how Italy tried to tie itself into the larger world trade throughout the Islamic world and the Ottoman Empire, which we're going to talk about in the next unit. These guilds eventually became incredibly powerful, controlling membership in the guild, and so the banking guild in Milan, or the banking guild in Milan or the banking guild in Florence would control membership and then be able to exert power in the government of these cities. In the end, these wealthy families became known as patricians. Oftentimes, these families were not traditionally noble. As you remember in the Middle Ages, the nobles, the lords, owed their fealty to the king, generally for great sort of actions that had happened in the past. You know, you pledged your sword to the king during the Crusades, and then your family got a knighthood and got a cool estate to live on and all this fun stuff. Well, with the rise of trade, and especially with the rise of these guilds, you got non-noble families, like the Medici family, who became far more wealthy and powerful than any of the nobles around. And so power in Italy started to fall away from these traditional noble houses and into these new commercial, banking, and entrepreneurial houses, who became known as patricians. They would then start displacing the nobles from the government of these cities, a lot of which were elected, because, of course, they again tied back to these ancient Greco-Roman ideas of democracy and representative government. And so these patricians started to control governments and society, and they continued to innovate and look for new ways of doing things. Traditionally, nobles were very comfortable with the status quo, with their fancy houses, owning the serfs, stuff like that, whereas a lot of these patricians were much more comfortable embracing new ideas, which led European thought and technology to continue to expand. As we mentioned, the governments of these cities were generally controlled by local councils who were elected. These councils became known as communes, and these communes would then be controlled by these wealthy families. So although it's ostensibly a democracy that's supposed to be electing and representing the people, in the end it becomes much more of an oligarchy controlled by the wealthy few because they could get their family members and supporters elected into these places. These wealthy families also began to support artistic works. New artistic styles were coming in from other places through trade routes. Cultural blending was happening. And so all of these patrons, all of these wealthy families, these patrician families, would have massive amounts of money. And so they would try to recruit great artists to create great works to decorate their city halls, their houses, their palaces, things like that, because all of this helped build up their wealth and status. And these cities competed with each other to create the greatest public spectacle, the greatest statues, the greatest artwork. And so this led to more demand and more people going into those sort of fields, which is going to lead to the creation of so much of the fabulous work that we're going to see here in the Renaissance. You can see here, we'll pause and take this one in. Hopefully this demonstrates sort of the power that artists have and how the different families want to take people like Donatello or hire people like Donatello to create amazing works for them because it increases their wealth and status. So all these things created the fertile soil from which the Renaissance would blossom. Next time, we're going to start looking at specific Renaissance artists, different Renaissance artistic techniques, and in general, how the European Renaissance changed the artistic and cultural landscape of Europe. Thank you for listening.